So welcome, my name is Rebecca Dirks Garcia. I am a parent education advocate, and I'm excited to be here with you today talking about making communication a two-way street. Feel free to turn off your camera if you are doing other stuff. I completely understand that. As parents, teachers, and community members, I know Saturdays are a busy time, but appreciate you taking time out of your day to join with me this morning. This is a topic that I am particularly passionate about and love, and so was grateful to have the opportunity to share with you this morning. So a little bit about me. As I said, I like to give myself the title of a parent education advocate, mainly because I wasn't quite sure what to call myself. I am a mom of 4 amazing neurodiverse kids, ages 27 to 11. And I am the immediate past president of Nevada PTA as of this week. I just ended close to 3 years of leading the organization during the midst of the pandemic. So I feel like it was 10 instead of 3. I am also the administrator of CCSD Parents, which is an online community of over 16,000 parents and educators who I hear from on a daily basis. And in my professional life, I am the director of community outreach for a nonprofit in Southern Nevada. And so the things we're going to cover today are geared towards the family engagement space, educators, parents, community. But there are also things that I deal with on a regular basis in my work life as well. And why did I pick the title, Making It a Two-Way Street? The reality is that a lot of the communication that we have isn't two-way, and yet we think it is. And so today I want to talk about some of the ways that we can actually make that move to being more of a two-way street. And we're going to start off the morning because it's still early for some of us probably, even though that keynote was amazing. And I think hopefully got us all energized to be thinking about how we can make improvements in the spaces that we live in. That it's always fun to start with a little humor. So I'm going to start with this and then ask for your reactions afterwards. So give me just 1 second. The bar is liking to be in the wrong space for me to play things.
Hello. This is my daughter. She's a big, brave girl, and she's going to have an operation today.
Name?
Tell the nice lady your name.
Danielle.
Danielle what?
Danielle Lloyd.
Age?
Nearly 6.
You're 5.
Yes.
We'll say 5 then. Address? Where do you live?
With Mommy and Daddy.
1772 Lincoln Road.
We got there. Putting your details in now.
Danielle's going to have her tonsils removed.
I've got her down for a double hip replacement.
Oh, no, well, there must be some kind of mistake.
Computer says no.
Well, that must be some other Danielle Lloyd.
Computer says no. There's only one Danielle Lloyd on the system. Do you want the double hip replacement or not?
No, clearly she doesn't need it.
Well, she may do in the future.
Look, we saw Dr. Phillips last week, and she definitely has an appointment for today to have her tonsils removed.
Computer says no.
Well, could you speak with somebody?
I could, but...
Well, thank you so much. You've been just great.
Oh, could I borrow a moment of your time to fill out the customer service questionnaire?
Have any of you felt like you were in that situation before? Pop in the chat, share that experience of what it's felt like in the past of trying to deal with that experience of having an engagement, and that's what you see and hear. Anybody been in that situation? Anybody relate at all to trying to talk to somebody and you feel like, where am I at? What's happening? Yes, all business, right? Like sometimes, how does it make you feel when you're in those situations? Stonewalled, I like that, like you're a number. Frustrated. How often do sometimes when we're in environments where we should be having a positive interaction instead feel like we're in that situation of what I always now say, because I've used this video for years in different presentations, computer says no, right? That the immediate response is that you just aren't getting what you need back, that you aren't hearing, you aren't being understood. And yet you need something from the other party. And that's really why being intentional about communication is so important. And this goes both ways. A lot of times when we talk about communication, we spend time focused on the educator side of things. And I know most of you, or a lot of you coming today, are educators, and I appreciate that. And a lot of the power behind how communication happens in the school family environment is up to educators, because that space and those decisions are often being made at the educator level. But it is a two-way street with multiple stakeholders. It's not just two cars passing. There's a lot of us trying to share the same road. And if we're not intentional, that's when barriers and obstacles come about. But in the end, the question is, how do we communicate effectively for our kids? And so I did say that I'm the immediate past president of Nevada PTA, and I love the National PTA Standards for Family School Partnerships. If you're not aware, they have just recently been updated with advisors such as Dr. Karen Mapp and others. These are the standards that set the foundation for school family partnership policies across the nation at the district and national level for decades now. And National PTA just went on multi-year effort to update them to current needs. And the definition for communicate effectively, standard 2, is that the school supports staff to engage in proactive, timely, and two-way communication so that all families can easily understand and contribute to their child's educational experience. So today we're going to talk about 5 things to consider in how to make your communication effective in order to, that last line, impact the child's educational experience. The first being language. One of the number one things that I always say when I talk to educators about speaking with families is that simplicity is key. It's important to understand your audience. We have educators from across Nevada joining us today, as well as families and community members. And one thing I learned in the last several years, being able to engage with families and educators from all the districts across the state, is that communities will often have shared issues, also have differences. And so when you're speaking to your families, when families are speaking to educators, it's important that we understand who we're speaking to. Limit jargon and acronyms. I lovingly call this edu-speak. And I always say that if somebody like me, who I sit on district, state, and national committees and councils, sit in a room and go, what's that? That's probably a sign that a whole lot of other people are confused. I still remember a time I had with one of my elementary kids back when they were in elementary school. We were doing parent-teacher conferences, and my son kept talking about SLGs. And I was the local PTA president. I was very engaged and active in education. This was my 3rd out of 4th kids. And finally, almost all the way through the conference, I finally stopped and said, what is an SLG? It was something that my son and his teacher totally understood, but it was not a term that I knew at all. But because the teacher thought I operated in the education space, that I would just know it. And so it's important that in addition to limit jargon and acronyms, that you're careful about the assumptions of who you're speaking to. And it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask for clarifying questions so that you know whether or not people understand it. Another really important thing is that when you're writing communication or content, so social media posts or reminders, letters home, even websites, think about the level of education that you're writing to. While many in the education space have higher education degrees, sometimes 2, 3, and 4, for mass media communications, that's often targeted at somewhere between the 5th and 8th grade reading level. And that's important because not everybody has the same level of comfort in reading and reading English. So keeping language simple and easy to understand helps ensure that more people are going to be able to access it and use that content. Additionally, you need to consider the tone and the content that's being presented. It's just like when somebody looks at me, often my face will tell you what I'm thinking before words come out of my mouth. The same thing happens for all of us, or many of us, in verbal communication, but it also happens in written communication. And so you need to make sure that you're paying attention to the tone that's being used and how that will be perceived by your audience. And don't just assume that you understand how the audience will receive that. So asking for feedback, checking and clarifying and adapting are all important steps in keeping things simple. And then you'll hear me hopefully today say several times, keep the focus on the child. At the end of the day, the one commonality that we all share in the education space is that we want children to be able to reach their full potential. We want kids to succeed. And that is the link that we all share. We may have a lot of different backgrounds and understandings and education levels, but at the end of the day, if we remember that this is about the children, it changes how we have our conversations. Additionally, when we think about language, and this is directly from Standard 2 Gold 1 in the National Standards for Family School Partnerships, the question to ask is, are families able to receive and share information in culturally and linguistically sustaining ways? How are we ensuring that all of our families, all of our community, is being able to understand, receive, and share information that they can understand and is relevant to them from a cultural perspective? How are we addressing access by providing things like interpretation, translation, and/or other accommodations? Oftentimes, we think about this after we've had a situation arise. And so the question to ask is beforehand, what can we do when we're planning an event, when we're creating written or electronic communications, or setting up conferences, rather than waiting to figure out if support is needed or if we need to figure something out, which creates a really awkward situation. You want to start at the beginning to ask those questions. I love this quote from Brene Brown. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And I want you to think for a minute and then put in the chat, as you communicate, ask, how can I be clearer? Think about for a second, what was a time when you did not have clear communication? Looking back at that time, what could have been done to make that better? Think about that for a second and then put your answer in the chat. What's a time when communication was unclear and how could that have been improved? Anybody have a thought? It could be with families, it could be with students, it could be with other educators. One thing that full sentences and explicit. Explicit, that was a term when I started getting involved in education that I kind of didn't understand why it was used so frequently. And now, as a parent, I've discovered the magic of explicit communication. So often I will say something to my kids, assuming that they understand what I mean. Do XYZ is what I'm thinking in my head, and what they hear is something completely different. And when I look back, I realize that I added assumptions into the process that weren't clear for my child. Yeah, those detailed instructions. And so I think sometimes, though, when adults communicate with adults, we think that being clear or explicit is diminishing or disrespectful. We think that it's okay to do with kids, but maybe it's not okay to do with peers or colleagues. But again, this quote by Brené Brown, I love it. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So making sure that language is simple, culturally and linguistically responsive, and clear is kind. That's what helps form a foundation of positive communication. The next thing I want to talk about is assumptions. And how many of you attended the keynote this morning? So if you're watching this on the recording, I highly recommend you check the keynote if you didn't get a chance to listen this morning, because she talked so beautifully about assumptions and bias and so many of those concepts that really impact how we communicate with each other. We're talking about a two-way street, right? That's the analogy, that's the title of today's presentation. Have you ever been in a situation where the two-way communication felt like this? That instead of traveling easily in both directions and everybody working together, that it just felt like there was a crash and then a traffic jam? So often that comes because of assumptions that are being made. So take a minute and look at this picture. If you see this picture, what are some assumptions that you're going to make about this group of people? Put in the chat, anything. Can be school related, it can be personal, anything. What are assumptions that you're making just by looking at this picture in 10 seconds? Mom and dad are married, related to each other, family. Anybody else? She's carrying a backpack. Do you think that they're taking her to school? The little girl? And most of us are assuming this is a mom and dad taking the child to school, right? Oh, yep. So you're thinking maybe they're going to the airport. You're right. That does look more like an airport parking lot than it does a school parking lot. This is a quick picture that you're looking at on a presentation this morning, but we see these snapshots on school playgrounds, at activities, at parent-teacher conferences, all the time. And how often do we make assumptions about who's related to each other, how people are connected, what their education level might be, what language they might speak? My children are all Hispanic. I am not. And my youngest daughter, we live in a heavily Hispanic area of Las Vegas, and she's always attended schools in our area. And I can't tell you how many times when she would be little playing anywhere in our neighborhood, other well-intentioned Hispanic moms would come up to my daughter and ask in Spanish, "Where's your mom?" And my daughter actually didn't speak Spanish very well. And I was her mom sitting a few feet away. They wanted to help a little girl who they thought was disconnected from her parents, not realizing that I was right there ready to help her because of those types of assumptions that we make. And we make those assumptions in our communication as well. Oh, I love that. You teach online. I always say, now that I meet people who I've only interacted with for years on Zoom and online, I say all the time, yes, I live outside of the little box, right? I have a body attached to my head. I have other things that come into view. But when you're so used to engaging with somebody in one setting, seeing somebody outside of that can feel very different. I always remember when my kids would run into a teacher at like Target or Walmart, and it was like, oh my goodness, the teacher lives outside of school, right? And again, it's those assumptions that we all do based on the story we have, our lived experiences, as well as the environments that we're used to engaging with people. And these can limit how we communicate with people. And so it's important to think about them at the forefront to address them. So how can we question assumptions? Again, this morning's keynote covered this way better than I can, but just a few things when it comes to communicating. Recognize that assumptions are barriers to relationships. And at the end of the day, the purpose of communication is both information sharing and building relationships, because that's what moves the needle for kids. You can send information all day long on a one-way street to families. That's not going to move the needle for kids in most cases. And it's definitely not going to move the needle for kids who need us the most to be there for them. It's the relationships that are transformative in family engagement. Avoid deficit-based approach. Focus on positive. Anytime any of us come with the problem first, how do we feel? What's human nature? What's the first response? Defensiveness, right? As soon as somebody says, well, your child, or the first thing is not my child. And so you want to think about, how are we focusing on the positive before we look at the deficits? Because you don't know how many times a family has been stuck in deficit mode. And if you add it one more time, they're not listening. But if you start with positive, it can lead to the opportunity to address how to meet those challenges in a different way. Perception matters, and that's for everybody. I have found in sitting on shared stakeholder groups where you have community, educators, families, administrators, support staff, all the people who live in the education ecosystem, in the community of schools. There's so many different moving parts and people that help support kids. When you sit down and talk to all the different people, they don't all have the same perception. And perception becomes reality if it's not addressed. Additionally, I always said, I got asked to be interviewed all the time during the pandemic in the news. And I was on national NPR and the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine. And again, the reporters would ask me this question: what do parents think about XYZ? And this was in the middle of the pandemic. Nevada has 500,000 students in our education system. And you've got a lot of parents related to those kids, and not all maybe their biological parents. That's one of the assumptions, right? That you have to question. Families and other caregivers are the ones who are helping our kids. But all the time I would be asked, what do parents think? And my response back was, they don't agree, because that was reality. It's really nice and easy to say everybody thinks this, but that's not reality. So it's important to recognize that individual opinions and perceptions aren't always the same. Also, when you're talking about assumptions, foster transparency and allow for feedback. When people feel like they aren't being heard, when people feel like things aren't being clearly communicated up front, it immediately leads to more of those perception issues. Recognize that everybody has a story, and your lived experience isn't my lived experience. That doesn't make it good or bad. That just makes it reality, right? That you didn't grow up the way I did. I didn't grow up the way you did. You don't know what my home life is like, and I don't know what yours is. But that doesn't mean that our stories and our experiences don't have value and meaning and beauty. But we need to stop thinking that we all understand what everybody else is going through, because we don't. And it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to say, well, what does that mean to you? How can I better understand what's going on in your life? And again, I'd refer to the keynote this morning on this last line, but important to always think about bias, culture, language, and differing abilities. As a mom of neurodiverse kids who don't look like they have a disability, I can tell you how often I have to stand up and be their advocate to explain to other people, educators so frequently, about the challenges that they're dealing with that aren't obvious, and ask for help on behalf of my kid who doesn't want to feel different and doesn't want to be singled out. And so often people say, well, I didn't know that. And it's because they assumed something without knowing my kid's full story. Yeah, Lindsay, I appreciate that. Just that being kind. You never know what's going on with other people. The next thing I want to talk about is time. Does anybody else feel like the clock's on there? That's totally me. I'm a single parent, work full time, super engaged in volunteer work, and I feel like that all the time. And so time matters. So often we're like, why isn't somebody responding to me? I keep calling this family and nobody answers the phone. And I'll tell you, I'm one of those people. Educators call me all the time at the end of their day to try to talk to me. And that's directly in the middle of when I am almost always at a meeting for work. And so it's not that I don't want to pick up the phone. It's that I'm leading a meeting or I'm engaged in a work project that I can't step away from. So I communicate to people all the time that email is the best way to reach me. And yet I still get phone calls wanting to discuss things because they think that's more personal. But for me, if I can't actually pick up the phone, it's not effective. So many families have inflexible work schedules. They're working shift jobs. They're working 2 and 3 jobs. I work in workforce development in the nonprofit that I work at. And I can tell you that Nevada has extremely high rates of single parent families, most often women, working 2 and 3 jobs at or below the poverty level. And those parents, it's not that they don't care about their kids, it's that they're literally trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their kid's head. And so if you call during work, and that means that if they answer the call, they're going to get written up, they're not going to answer the call. So recognize those caregiving responsibilities too. I know when I had kids, they were little and I couldn't always do things, even though I wanted to for my oldest daughter, who was a teenager when I was having other babies. Also, I talked about that mismatched schedule. My schedule doesn't match an educator's schedule often, and recognize that co-parenting means that families are sometimes sharing households, and time means that you're coordinating with a lot of different parties to try to get something that fits. The next thing is technology, and I'm going to ask you a question. In CCSD parents, so 16,000 parents and educators, we have consistently had the #1 issue when I ask the question about communication, including this week. What would you want to share with educators about how to better communicate? What would you say is the response? If you ask families how to better communicate with them, what do you think they would say? And these are families who are online. Anybody? Like, you know what is happening in the class? That's definitely one that people want to know. I'm going to shock you because I don't think anybody's going to guess it unless you exist in that space with us. The #1 thing that parents complain about and ask explicitly, very explicitly for, is that when you email about a child, that there's an email signature with the name of the teacher, the school, the class, the email address is available in the reply to screen, which isn't always the case if you're using a system like Infinite Campus or some of the other technologies. And that the subject line also includes some information that lets you know who the heck this is about. I can tell you I have 3 kids at 3 different schools right now enrolled in K-12. And they have combined, I think, 22 teachers. If I get an email that says, your child is missing assignments at a no reply email address, how am I going to answer it? How am I going to know which kid and which class it relates to? Something so basic for 3 straight years has been the #1 communication request from parents in the community that I work with. It's fixable, and yet it's something that we think spend so much time on some of the other issues, thinking that that's what's so important, when something so simple like put a subject line with a class and a school, because sometimes it is going to a whole class, but just put 7th grade science with Mr. K, something that lets us know who that is so that it's actionable and respondable to a parent. When you're thinking about technology, also don't make assumptions regarding comfort level with technology, including for kids. I have a child that is not a digital native. Online learning and computer-based learning, which is so prevalent right now, is the least successful option for this child. But that can be the same thing for an adult. A lot of times, especially after the pandemic, we still make assumptions that everybody has a device at home. Everybody has connectivity. Everybody knows how to use their devices, and that we can support each other, or that families know how to support each other. Even educators, I found, sometimes are still trying to figure out how to catch up with all this wave of technology that they weren't trained for 10, 20, 30 years ago. So it's important when it comes to technology, it can make life easy, but it can also make things more complicated. And so how you use it makes a big difference. Lindsay, thank you so much for pointing that out. Like, a lot of districts are using Canvas, and that can make a big difference. And Lindsay, in answer to that question, sorry, I didn't see it. No, it's consistent across the board that families want the information to be clear and the email communication. The other thing is the next one that also kind of answers that is coordinate information sharing across communication outlets. The second most frustrating existence for families with technology is that one teacher uses Remind, one teacher uses Class Dojo, one teacher sends IC messages, one teacher, will doesn't have Canvas passing back to Infinite Campus. So you actually need to check Canvas to see what's happening, because the Infinite Campus grades don't update until right before the gradebook closes. When a parent has, again, 20, 22, sometimes teachers to try to figure out how to track, if every single one of those teachers is choosing a different platform and a different method, at some point, a lot of parents just say, I can't handle it anymore. If you don't reach out to me directly, I'm just going to hope that all's going okay. And that's not what we want, right? Because that reduces the effectiveness of the technologies that we're trying to use. But it's because even though you're maybe asking families what they want in your class, if it's not coordinated against your school, across your school system, it's still leaving families going, what the heck's happening? And maybe they've tuned out of one, and suddenly that's the one that has the information, but it didn't go out via the email communication system that your district uses. Often ParentLink, but districts across the state use different systems. And then again, ask and share preferences. It's okay to say, I don't do well with, trying to figure out Canvas. Can you help and support me on that as a family? It's okay. I loved in conferences, somebody said they asked, do you need support learning how to use Canvas? Figuring out how people will actually use the information is so important, because if we have a great technology system that nobody's using, or nobody's using well, it actually isn't impacting the positive communication that we think it's supposed to be providing. You're right. I think a questionnaire would be great. And I will look. That is a project that PTA did at a national level, and I'm not sure that a questionnaire was created, but that is something that I think would be really helpful for educators to send home at the beginning of the year, just check boxes, or even as a Google form. Again, not everybody's great with technology, but I have found people have been adapting to technology that also recognize, and hopefully you can see I'm holding up, I work off of a desktop, a laptop, and a phone. Not all families have that. So make sure that whatever you're using is mobile responsive, and Canvas isn't always the best for teachers who are using Canvas. But that check sheet would make a big difference. And then finally, I want to talk about motivation. At the end of the day, when we look at effective communication, at the heart of why communication succeeds or fails is the motivation behind that communication. Stephen Covey said, when the trust account is high, communication is easy, instant, and effective. I can tell you that with educators that I have built relationships with. I was lucky enough to have an educator teach 3 out of my 4 kids for 1, and in one case, 2 years. And by the time she got my last child during the middle of the pandemic, the fact that I just knew her and she knew me meant that that year was not completely lost for my child, who desperately struggled during that year, because the trust was already so high. But before school even started, she reached out in a phone call and said, let's talk and figure out what's going on in your life and what you need me to support. What's happening at home? What needs are there that are going to impact their ability to engage in online learning? And the fact that she took 30 minutes, and I know she did this with every family, meant that the year started out with a totally different perspective because of the investment that she made. And I recognize the time challenges that educators have. I know you guys have your own families and everything that you're trying to deal with, and so much paperwork and extra stuff that constantly gets added on. But sometimes that initial investment can pay off so much in saving you time down the line. At the end of the day, people listen to whom they trust. So when we build relationships, the communication comes naturally. So be willing to listen and adapt. If people say, I don't understand this, don't keep sending the same thing home. Recognize expertise in others. I am not an educator. I did not go to school for that, but I am an expert on my kid. That I know. And when we partner together, me being the expert on my kid and an educator being the expert on education, that's the magic. That's why education, in the sense of a partnership between families and schools, makes such a difference on academic outcomes for kids. So when we recognize that expertise, it helps us to be successful. And again, focus on the shared desires for student success. That's the common link we all have, and know the children. I am willing to deal with a lot of challenges if I know that the educator that my kid has knows them. And sometimes that means that they're annoyed by them, right? Because I'm a parent, I get annoyed by my kids sometimes. But when I know that they know even just a simple detail about my kid, about how one of my kids loves fantasy and fiction and Dungeons and Dragons, then I know that they've taken some time to build a relationship, and I'm more willing to listen because I know that that investment is coming on the other side. So at the end of the day, it's all back to the kids. So as we've talked today, the things that I want to make sure I've communicated is that quality communication is worth the investment. So often in life, and this can be across all things in workspaces, I work in social service, so we see it all the time, in education, in families, that we spend a lot of times dealing with the outcome of miscommunication. We spend a lot of time dealing with the car crash because then we're stuck in the traffic jam, right? We deal with a lot of time thinking we're going one direction and the other people are going the total opposite direction, and we're trying to meet in the middle at a single destination. And so we spend so much time dealing with the end result of the miscommunication, but forget how, if we take the time to be intentional with quality, effective communication, it can save us time. But even more than saving us time and energy, it makes a difference for kids. Because we also, and I should have included this, when they know that everybody around them is communicating effectively, then they have the opportunity to be heard and seen. And when kids feel heard and seen, they're going to tell you what they need. So as you make that investment, think about language, assumptions, time, technology, motivation. And I hope you'll pick one thing, and I'm seeing some conversation in the chat that I love about how to make it more effective so that as you move forward, you can see the positive outcome for this. And I know that when you make that effort, we see the positive benefits on both sides. So the goal at the end is going from the do not enter wrong way to the connection, that meeting of the minds that can happen through communication. This presentation, I believe, will be sent out to everybody. I put some links of the information that I referenced in here, and my contact information is also at the end. You can find me pretty much everywhere online at Rebs Garcia. And I'm happy to discuss any questions that anybody has in our last few minutes. If anybody has any questions or comments. Suzanne.
Hi. I was just wondering, I'm actually teaching one of the classes at UNR in family engagement, and are the new PTA standards, are they available yet?
So they did just this week, they posted them on the website. The standards have not changed. Okay. They decided, just because of the way, you know, life is, what they did is they evaluated everything kind of under the standard. Okay. And so that's what's been updated. So they are published on pta.org. And then also November 17th, I'll put a plug, there is a town hall to announce and share the new standards. And you can also sign up for that on the links that I shared under the Center for Family Engagement, which is a PTA funded center. They are hosting a town hall with National Department of Education folks and a whole bunch of other people on November 17th, and that's virtual.
Thank you.
No problem. Well, thank you all for spending some time with me this morning. I hope that it was helpful. And thank you for everything that everybody on here at the end of the day. We're here because we want kids to have a better life and a better future. And I think when we as the adults invest the energy in figuring out how to do it better, amazing things happen. And I know I am so grateful for educators who take the time to pour into my kids. You are known, you are heard, you are talked about at family dinner tables years later for the things that you do. And I appreciate it so much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.